welcome to our next keynote speaker, which is Maree Teesson, who's known by all of us here at the Brain and Mind Centre. Maree is Director of the Matilda Centre for Research in Mental Health and Substance Use. She's also NHMRC Principal Research Fellow at the University of Sydney. She's received many awards and accolades, including Companion of the Order of Australia in the 2018 Australia Day Honours List. She's a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Health and Medical Sciences, a National Mental Health Commissioner, and a member of the National Health and Medical Research Council and founding member of the MHS Management Committee. So Maree's joining us and she's going to tell us about lessons to be learned, trends of the mental health of adolescents in the community. So welcome, Maree, and thank you.
Thanks so much, Michael, and Matthew, and it was fascinating hearing Michael's presentation, and it's just great to be here this morning and talk to you. Now I'm going to shift gear a little bit from babies, very, very cute neonatal babies, so thank you for that presentation, Michael, and talk about teenagers. So I'm going to go to the teenage years. Fascinating also to hear the presentations on sleep, and I'll be covering a little bit of that in my presentation as well. So just to acknowledge I'm just going to the next slide. It'd be really handy if I could do that. There we are. The traditional owners of the land on which my team, the Matilda Centre, rests, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I'm coming to you today from the Camirigal people's lands and to pay respects to their ancestors and owners of those lands. So just as I start, I will just acknowledge my team pre-COVID days, the Matilda Centre at the University of Sydney, and I have great pleasure in presenting some of our work here today. So the mental health of adolescents in the community. What are the trends? Well, way before we were experiencing the pandemic and the crisis of COVID, young people were facing their own crisis. This was probably represented most starkly for us in data that came from the US. So this is over 1 million young people between the years 1991 and 2018. So Kerry Keys has been monitoring their mental health over that period of time in the Monitoring the Future study. And she was observing between the years 1991 to the years 2000 to 2008, a downward trend in the reported levels, the mean depression scores, the mean rates of depression scores in the young boys and the young girls who were interviewed as part of the Monitoring the Future study. But in 2009 to 2012, something started to change. So for the young females in these cohorts, the rates of mean depression started to increase. And you can see that top curve increasing towards 2019. Slightly later, similar patterns were happening with the young males. So we don't have in Australia data that monitors the health of adolescents like the US Monitoring the Future study. But fortunately, over the last 14 years at the Matilda Centre, with collaborators across the country, we've been undertaking many and large randomised control prevention trials. And so we were able to bring together the data from over 14,000 young Australians who were 13 years of age at each of those time points. So 13-year-olds in 2007, 13-year-olds in 2012, 14 and 19. And using the same measure, we were able to get an indication of their level of psychological distress. And this is a measure here where they're reporting levels of high psychological distress, in this case on the K6. So similar trends. were emerging and patterns emerging over time in 13-year-olds. So in 2007, we had 5% reporting high psychological distress. And in 2019, the cohort of 13-year-olds were reporting closer to 15%. Were we seeing the same patterns across males and females? We were. On the left, you'll see the males, and on the right, you'll see the females. So the males, the increases are occurring, but at a slower rate. For the females, the increase is now at closer to 1 in 5 females reporting high levels of psychological distress. We were also mapping, interestingly, changes that were happening for young people across their alcohol use and psychological distress. And these are very similar crossover patterns that are happening in Australia and in the US. So this is first sip of alcohol, first full glass of alcohol. So in 2007, about 1 in 5 young people were reporting that they'd had their first full glass of alcohol at the ages of 13. And by 2019, this is now reduced to well under 5%. So while we're seeing very high rates of psychological distress, we're also seeing incredibly interesting changes happening in our society for the age at which young people are first using alcohol or drinking alcohol. But before we get too excited about this, the rates of risky drinking are still significant. So when I talk about risky drinking, I'm talking about 11 or more drinks in a sitting. So it's not insignificant. And the rates are still very high in 12 to 17-year-olds and extraordinarily high in 18 to 24-year-olds. So 4% will report that they will have drunk more than 11 drinks on a sitting, and 15% of 18 to 24-year-olds. So Australia, unfortunately, still remains, as my American colleagues describe us, God's gift to alcohol researchers. These trends in mental health are also being reflected in the trends in suicide deaths in Australia. So when looking at 15 to 19-year-olds, the age-specific suicide rates from 1989 through to 2018, they were trending relatively flat or with a downward trend, again until the years of 2012 and 2010 to 2012, where we were seeing a 5-year trend for males and females combined of increasing, unfortunately. So on top of these existing trends, then we hit COVID and the bushfires. And we had a most impressive presentation by Kerry on the impacts of COVID and our response to that. Kerry talked about some of the data that is starting to come from Australia. Unfortunately, again, we do not have the same levels of data that are available internationally. But here I've pulled out the COVID-19 mental health data for the US, which does break down the responses to COVID in the US in June across the different age groups. And the adolescents and the young cohorts are in the red there. And again, you will see across every indicator, they are elevated. Anxiety, depression, using substances in order to cope, having COVID-related trauma responses. So similarly in Australia, our population data is showing currently in the latest round in August, 3 times the rates of anxiety and depression in the population now compared to 2 or 3 years ago. Similar rates as observed here in this data, and similar increases as observed in the US. But here in this US data, we see that significant impact on young people. So the impacts of COVID on youth on top of the already increasing and elevated rates are and are still significant. And of course, young Australians will be hit hardest by the economic downturn. So the reasons underlying these increases, not just the COVID-related increases, but the long-term increases, really require urgent attention, and they are just not at the moment fully explained. Now, the first thing people go to when they think about, or the first response or the first answer, and I'm imagining a few of you are thinking about this now, and I don't know whether it'll appear in my screen, but you'll straight away think it has to be our use of smartphones and mobile phones. That our smartphones have destroyed a generation. So this is often and very often the first and the root cause that everyone would consider, because between 2008 and 2010, smartphone use, particularly amongst young people, went from very low through to almost complete saturation. But the answer and the story is just not that simple. So here we looked at screen time and depression in nearly 4,000 adolescents. And while high mean levels of social media, the evil social media, and high mean levels of computer use were all associated with increased rates in depression, the high mean levels of television use over 4 years was associated with less depression. And just to make the 13 to 18-year-old gamers very happy, video gaming was not associated with depression. So the relationship between screen time and depression, while there, is clearly more complicated, and the solution will just not be banning smartphones, if ever that was possible. One of the other major trends that we were observing happening at this time were also changes in alcohol use and exposure. And this, I want to just shift gears a little bit, because this is about looking at alcohol exposure in women. And women, because women particularly potentially have an impact on mental health of their offspring if we are seeing changes in exposure to alcohol use during pregnancy. So we've been looking at birth cohort trends in epidemiology and asking whether the anecdotal research that we've been seeing in terms of changes in alcohol use amongst women are actually being reflected globally in the epidemiology. And so my amazing colleagues, Professor Tim Slade and Kath Chapman and Matt Sunderland and others, pulled together the data over the last pooled data over 1891 to 1991 birth cohorts. So this is data from over combined sample of over 4 million people. And when we look at the gender gap, males to female ratio of alcohol and alcohol harms by birth cohorts, you can see that the traditional understanding that alcohol harms were heavily impacting and the burden was felt amongst men was true for those cohorts born in the turn of the century in 1891 and 1910. But as we go along, we can now see that for those cohorts born in 1991 and 2000, those cohorts born in 1986 to 1990, that gender gap in this data is now completely closed. And two things are happening. One, the harms are increasing there's some evidence harms are increasing in young females, and there's some evidence that the harms are decreasing in males. So controlling methodologically for survey design, age at the time of survey, specific indicators, and world region and assessment timeframes, we're now seeing that the gender gap for harms in alcohol, and ratio of alcohol use is pretty much closed. So those cohorts in 1981, 1985, 1986, 1990, they're the parents of the adolescents of today. So is alcohol exposure a risk factor? And is it associated with poorer neurodevelopmental outcomes in children, and particularly psychological and mental health outcomes? Is this one of the factors contributing to the changes we're seeing? So 1 in 2 Australian women do drink at some stage during pregnancy, but that's at incredibly low levels for the majority. And this is the work of PhD student Brianna Lees on my team, Louise Mutin, and colleagues in the US, and Lexine Stupinski. We've been examining through the ABCD study, which is the largest longitudinal study of brain development in the US, what the impacts of exposure to alcohol in utero are. We examined children aged 9 to 10 with high quality imaging data and examined psychological, behavioural and cognitive data. And it is a phenomenal data set. The analysis is conducted across the nearly 10,000 young people who are participating in this amazing study. And the data is publicly available. So alcohol use during pregnancy, we found, was a risk factor for youth mental health problems in the ABCD study. And these were very subtle yet significant differences. So for alcohol use, 1 to 2 drinks during any week in pregnancy were risk factors for anxiety, depression, attention problems, high impulsivity, early alcohol experimentation, and altered brain structure. And 3 or more drinks per occasion, in addition to the above, showed risks for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and operational defiant disorder. And the prenatal alcohol exposure was associated with greater cerebral and regional volumes and regional surface area. And we saw through the mediation analyses, the relationship occurring both through the aberrant brain structure and also directly. So we saw particular and specific areas of the brain being associated with greater cerebral region and regional surface area. The less versus greater volume was a challenging finding, and we've argued that the apparent disparate findings may be explained by the inclusion of both pre and post pubertal adolescents and young adults in previous studies. This is the first study, the largest study, that has a narrow enough age range around 13 years to try to understand some and to control for some of the potential mitigating confounds of neurodevelopmental stage, which is incredibly important, as Michael outlined, because there is just so much development happening in the brain at this time. So it may be that the trajectories of grey matter change are opposing. That is, the initial expansion of the cerebral cortex with subsequent reductions in cortical grey matter beginning around puberty. So one other question we asked was, is there a dose-response relationship? And this is the CBCL internalizing score, and one of the other indicators, cerebral volume. And yes, there were significant dose-response relationships between the estimated total alcohol consumed and the outcomes. So food for thought in terms of potential public health responses to at least one risk factor or potential risk factor for poorer adolescent health. Finally, the other factor I wanted to touch on, which is one that Michael mentioned in terms of the very early babies, and that was around sleep. So have there been changes in trends in sleep? Again, I'm going to rely on the US data. And this is again the Monitoring the Future study, and the top line there is the blue line. And we have see a significant reduction in the percentage of adolescents who report having 7 or more hours of sleep during each evening. So not talking about the reasons why this is happening, but the trends in reductions in numbers of hours of sleep are quite significant over the cohort periods 1990 to 2020. So we're seeing significant changes in passive screen time. We've got very significant changes in the experience of alcohol within the community, and we're seeing significant changes in sleep. So our thought is maybe we need to think differently about adolescent mental health and prevention. At the moment, we take a very narrow and siloed approach and go at each of these issues individually. But maybe that isn't the way to approach it for adolescents. And maybe digital, rather than being the curse, is the opportunity for us to try and bring these issues together and have a response which speaks to where the adolescent is in this incredibly dynamic and developing system, and responds by understanding the complexity and the interactions between these issues. So we've been working with adolescents, developing and designing cartoons and storyboards and storylines that reflect both the position from which they are coming from, but also embed in them challenges to the social norms and normative behaviours and social influences so they are experiencing, and the psychological skills they have to embed in programs and in their lives, so that if they are experiencing mental health, they have the best capacity, poor mental health, they have the best capacity to respond. So these are like neighbours for drug and alcohol and mental health prevention. And each of these characters, there's a backstory and relationship between Jane, who's the geeky one with the brown hair, Claire, who's the geeky one with the brown hair, not at all modelled off me, and Jane in the middle there, and their friends through the program. And they're embedded in the school curriculum, so they're also loads of fun. It's actually the best fun I have doing research working on these. And we've combined these for substance use, depression and anxiety prevention, and this is a large cluster randomised control trial that we conducted over 6,000 young people across the country, showing that just these brief digital online interventions delivered at the right time make a difference to the outcomes and improve, reduce alcohol use and delay uptake of alcohol use, but also delay onset of anxiety. And these changes are maintained over a 3, and we've just completed the 7-year follow-up of the, and these are just the alcohol outcomes from one of the studies. So we've gone at alcohol, we've gone at alcohol plus mental health, and now we're shifting gear to examine not just those 2 risk factors, but the multiple risk factors that young people are potentially experiencing. And so we're currently in the field with a program called Health for Life, and that cluster RCT, again run across nearly 7,000 young people in Queensland, New South Wales and WA, will tackle multiple lifestyle risk behaviours amongst young people. So this is aimed at 12 and 13-year-olds, and you can see there 66% in that 12 to 17 age range have consumed alcohol, 86% exceed guidelines for screen time, 70% have sleep problems, 82% do not meet guidelines for physical activity, etc. And we know that these risk factors interact and that they also are very strong predictors of poor mental health at the age of 18. Can we get in and make a difference? So what's in the programs? As I said, interactive cartoon storylines using social influence and CBT, built through peer-led learning, student summaries and individual activities, all mapped across to the school curriculum. There's a Health for Life smartphone app reinforcing the behavioural changes and opportunities to use SMART goals for young people. Choosing your health buddy and using motivational quotes and rewards to implement. A booster app, which is offered as additional content for those that are 14 to 16 years of age who are still experiencing at risk and still experiencing poor mental health at 16 years of age. So we're out in the field at the moment in 37 schools in New South Wales, 16 in WA and 18 in Queensland. And we're just at the first stage of collection of the follow-up data. So in summary, adolescent mental health is undergoing a rapid change. We've got broad population-based framework for prevention and intervention opportunities in Australia. And that, I think, is really the forward thinking and where we need to go next, better understand those risks and then better understand how we respond in an evidence-based way. And thank you very much for listening.
Well, thanks very much, Maree. Very comprehensive and, as you say, food for thought. We've got time for questions, so please send them through the Q&A or chat room. I suppose just one quick thing with the Smart app, in terms of engagement, have you found that, I mean, adolescents who have mood disturbance, do they still engage with their smartphones or do they tend to disengage?
It's a huge challenge, Michael. Really, I'm going to keep calling you Michael, you know that.
They're all saints, it doesn't matter.
It's a huge, huge challenge, the engagement. I think that's why we've actually embedded the cartoons into the school curriculum. Adolescents spend many of their waking hours at school, and they have to do their PDHPE lessons. And so it has been extraordinary. We get 100% uptake of those cartoons because they're embedded within the curriculum. And I actually think we've got to get a lot smarter at that. We're hoping that same sort of level of embedding, because you're absolutely right. Depressed young people, will they engage with the smartphones? It will be partly about normalising this, and it's also about it being peer-led. This isn't about us coming in and saying, telling the stories. It's working with young people to create those stories. So, yeah. But you're spot on, Matthew. That is a really big challenge, getting the engagement.
Claire Goldsberry's asked, what role does parenting have in the increased rate of psychological stress and drastically reduced alcohol consumption in young people?
Yeah, it's parenting and parenting influence is incredibly important. Young people do tend to go to their peers first for support, but parents themselves are critically important in the role of both supporting and then giving skills to deal with that increased anxiety and depression. I don't think, though, as I presented, there are going to be many factors that are associated with this. You know, whether that's what's driving the changes in sleep. Is it parents? Is it social media use? What are the negative consequences? So for my money, it's not going to be one of those. It's going to be many. But I'd also like to see parents as part of the solution. Though I've got to say we have a lot of challenges engaging parents in working with interventions in this space. And I think partly that's the stigma we've got to break down, and partly it's making the resources accessible. Do I think parents have a role in the alcohol reduction? Perhaps. We have had incredible changes and social changes and more knowledge now amongst parents about delaying use and delaying alcohol. But again, I think it's probably going to be multifaceted, and I'm curious how much of it is the different way that teenagers interact now socially. Like, it's not that you go out with your friends anymore, you're interacting with each other online or on games, and perhaps the opportunity for drinking in those social contexts aren't there. So thanks for the question, it's fascinating.
We've got one final question from Robert Harris. It says, we know from the adverse childhood experience studies the correlation between child trauma and drug and alcohol use. Is this a confounding factor when designing programs to engage with adolescents?
Yeah, I mean, we have two trials running at the moment for treatment of adolescents with significant history of trauma, and that is that's an incredibly important area, and one that we really, really do want to respond to. Does the trauma confound the relationship between adolescents and substance use? Those with trauma are at elevated rates of substance use, absolutely.
Look, thanks, Maree. We might leave it there just in the interest of time. There are loads more questions coming through, and Amir and Grace H both said, thank you for a wonderful presentation, and we can only concur. So thanks for joining the symposium and for really a great presentation.
Thanks, Matthew.